Hey everybody, I'm so glad to be here. Normally I get a little bit nervous before putting on trainings, but for some reason this one I just feel totally comfortable. It seems like a really relaxed atmosphere. Um, I just want to spend some time with you and share a little bit of what I've learned over the last few years and something that's just become something that I'm very passionate about. Um, it's become like part of who I am as a counselor. And I didn't learn about these things when I was in school. It wasn't anything we talked about. I hope maybe today I can get a spark going for you in this as well. So the goals of the training are that you will know what some experiential therapies are. And then also there's a basic framework. If you want to just dip your feet into this and try it, of asking the questions, what, so what, and now what. And then also, I want you to leave with at least one experiential technique that you can put into place in your practice. And I welcome you guys to jump in at any point, especially when I get into discussing the specific techniques. I've just got a bunch of lists and then wrote some things down that I like to use that may not even be on the screen. When we get into that portion, I just welcome you guys to jump in and ask questions and get a little bit of dialogue. So I can maybe fill in gaps that I may not realize are there. But John Dewey said experiential learning takes place when people are involved in a project or activity, the do. They look back at their experience critically, the reflect, and they determine what was useful or important to remember and then use this information in real life situations. We apply it. And it said we learn 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we both hear and see, 70% of what is discussed, 80% of what we experience, which is what we're going to talk about today, and 95% of what we teach to someone else. Doing things when we feel it in our body, it just makes so much difference as opposed to just having a head knowledge. And I know when I got into this field, I did a lot of talking, and as many people do, and I think that's what most schools teach is we talk and we work through things. And I think that's what a lot of our clients expect when they come to counseling is we're going to sit and we're going to talk about our problems. When we talk, we are using the prefrontal cortex, our logical brain. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a way of pulling people down into their body. And when we do trauma work, um, it is so important to bring them into their body. You can only have so much healing by just talking about what they've experienced. And people will feel like, yeah, I got it. Like, hey, let's think about how this situation is actually not safe. Like, not all men are unsafe. And the person will be like, yeah, I know, but you can tell they're just keyed up. And in their body, they're still carrying tension, anxiety, expecting something really bad to happen, even though logically in their prefrontal cortex, they know it's not going to happen. Um, so, how did I get into this world of experiential learning? I graduated, didn't know what I wanted to do in the field, and tried a few different things, but ultimately ended up in a residential facility. I stayed there for most of my career. And in that, working with adolescent males who were struggling with addictions, and they had a ropes course there. I went to a place in Nashville, Tennessee, and got trained in facilitating ropes courses, and I loved it. And it was amazing. And Along the way, I did really well with that. I felt good about what I was doing, and then I learned other things that were experiential that didn't necessarily involve the ropes courses. And that style of experiential therapy is what we call adventure therapy. There's a perceived risk at play, and there's some sort of goal that the group or the individual is trying to work towards. You put a challenge in front of them. So that's kind of where I started. And in that, I made a connection with someone who was doing work for another place in Nashville that's kind of a higher end facility, and people fly from all around the world to go work there. And she said, Nathan, you should go work at this place. And I was like, okay. And they had quite the vetting process, and somehow I sneaked through and ended up at this place. And I was going to do adventure therapy sessions. So couples usually or individuals, they would come to this place and stay for 4 days, and they would work with a therapist who followed along with them the whole way. But they would bring in people to facilitate different modalities. And so I was coming in to facilitate a 2.5 hour adventure therapy session, and I was doing two of those in one day. And my first one there, the therapist who was in there, he was one of the supervisors of this place, and I felt really intimidated, but also wanted to go in and like prove that I'm good enough to be here. And we did an activity, and then I sat them down to start processing it. And eventually, that therapist, I could just see him getting antsy. Like, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. And he got up, and the clients were talking about a very stressful moment they had in the car. And he said, "Show me." And they said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Show me the scene, set it up." And so they ended up setting up two chairs next to each other and sat in them as if they were sitting in a car. And he asked the guy, "Show me how you felt." And the guy said, "Like what I did?" And he said, "No, show me with your body how you felt." And at this point, I was just kind of stepping back, like I have no idea what's going on. And it took a while. He couldn't connect to how he felt and how to display that with his body. But he ended up finally holding a position, and the therapist said, "Nathan, I want you to pay attention to that. Now I want you to go sit in his seat and hold that position." And he had the client get up, and I held frozen, looking at his partner, um, and then he asked the other person, "Now what's coming up for you as you're looking at this?" And that was the moment I realized, like, they don't need me to do therapy for them. They've got this covered. I didn't know what was happening. I'd never seen anything like that, but I also was thinking I have to learn this. And so that was the beginning of me really digging in. I somehow figured out how to make it there. I learned from them, but realized I needed to learn from them, and like they didn't need me to show them anything. And so just got as much training as I could at that time. And so that was sort of the beginning of a different, like even deeper style of experiential therapy for me. It was pretty amazing. Um, but what we need to remember is trauma is stored in the body. And if you've never read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, it is just a must read as a therapist, especially if you're working with trauma, which surprise we all are, whether we know it or not. And so it's a must read. It took me way too long to read that book, and once I did, I was just a little bit humbled again. Like, why did this take so long for me to read the book? But a lot of these things will make so much more sense as far as incorporating the body into therapy and trauma work. When you read that book, it's pretty groundbreaking. Um, so also I've been in private practice. I left the residential setting and ended up in private practice for a few years before I came on to direct the counseling center at Freed-Hartman. And I still do a little bit of private practice on the side. We don't receive wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves after a journey that no one can take for us or spare us. So there are different kinds of experiential therapies. It's kind of like a square is a rectangle and a rectangle is a square. So there are many, many different kinds of experiential therapies. I've already talked to you a little bit about my adventure therapy, doing the ropes courses. Um, One that I've fallen in love with is psychodrama, learning what I have now. That other therapist was incorporating some psychodrama techniques into that session. There are others, yoga and equine therapy. I will say yoga, my understanding, needs to be incorporated carefully with clients who have been through trauma. Um, that's talked about in The Body Keeps the Score as well. But because of various types of trauma, when we ask people to hold certain positions in their body, it can be very triggering. But it is a type of experiential therapy that's utilized to help people work through trauma. It just needs to be done more carefully and more gradually. So if you want to start getting into doing some experiential therapy, we need to first do the experience. And again, this is kind of a basic, this is the outline for what I would use um, with the ropes courses or the team building exercises and things like that. So adventure therapy, this is the outline I would use. So we do an activity and then we process it. So that's the what, and that's what's happening right now. So space, body language, emotion, sensation. And then we generalize it to the so what. And then we ask, how can we apply it? The now what? And so, an example of what that might look like basically is I'm thinking of one of the ropes course activities where the team would work together to navigate across a series of cables, and it couldn't be done by themselves. And so they may be holding on to a tree and holding on to another person to get their reach further. And so then I would ask the group, so what happened in this group? And they'd say, well, I noticed I couldn't do it by myself. Oh, okay. So what happened? Well, someone supported me. Cool. So that's what happened in the group. And then the so what is, well, why is that a big deal? And so, well, I realize sometimes that in my life I can't do things by myself and I need support. Oh, wow, that is quite the epiphany. And then the now what is, okay, now that you know you need support, what are you going to do with that information? And so when we think about what, so what, now what, that's kind of a framework for how we can facilitate the processing part of an experiential activity. So I'm always thinking about these questions. And when I get to this, I'm going to say again, too, keep in mind at the time I was doing these ropes courses, I was still very much logical front brain working with these clients. And so I was, I would do the activity and then we would sit down and we would talk. And a lot of team builders do that. And I think that's fine. There's not necessarily anything wrong with it. But as I've grown in this area a little bit more, what I'm doing now instead is I'm following this model very much as it's unfolding in the activity. So um, when I say noticing space, noticing body language, noticing emotions and sensations, if I'm putting some sort of activity in front of a client, I might say, I notice you just took a step to the right. Can you tell me about that? And so it's the same what is going on, like what happened, but instead of doing the processing after, I'm doing it right in the moment. And experiential therapy, it takes very much being attuned to the client and what's going on in that moment. And it takes a level of comfort to um, have no idea where the session's going to go. And as I'm on this slide too, I'll say that activity that I said about them navigating through the course, um, when I saw these activities, I thought, oh, that's the purpose of this specific activity because that's what I saw happen with this group. And so therefore, when I facilitate the conversation, I need to make sure they leave with, we all need to have support. And sure, that's important. But what we need to realize with experiential is, even though that seemed like such an important thing to take from one group, what happens with another group may not be the same thing. And so if I, as an experiential therapist, come in with a goal of where I want them to get to, then I shut down what's actually going on in the moment. And so if I'm trying to make sure they know about support, then they keep giving these answers about this is what's going on. And I'm like, no, that's wrong. We're supposed to get to support. And that's an issue with me if I'm going down that way. I'm taking away what's actually going on in the moment. And we need to keep in mind that our clients, when they interact with these activities, they're coming into these activities with the same brain and body that has had life experiences. And so their brains are wired to view things and interact with life a certain way. So when I put some sort of experiential activity in front of them, they're coming in viewing it through the lens of their life experiences. So they're going to interact with the activity the same way they interact with life. So then when I try to force a lesson to be learned on them, it's getting in the way of what they actually need to be processing. So I, as the therapist, need to be fully aware of what's going on. I need to point out things that I see that may stand out, and then let the client kind of guide where it's going from there. And that can be kind of scary as a therapist because um, I have comfort with here's what the activity looks like, here's the outline. But then when we get into it, I don't know where it's going to go. And so I have to trust that I'm grounded and in tune with the client enough to see where it's going to go. I will also say, before I would go facilitate these activities, a lot of times I would get really nervous because I felt like I was out of my league, and I was for a while. And I had the same friend who worked there as well, she would get nervous too. And we would remind ourselves it's not really about our ability here. We have clients that are coming in wanting to do the work, and they're bringing what they need to bring into the room, and we need to remember that God's in the room too. And so I would pray before God help me to see what I need to see. And so just as a reminder, if you're not comfortable with that with yourself, God is big enough to make sure the client leaves with what they need to leave with. And even if I blow it, like that can be part of the processing itself, just being super um, in tune with what's going on in that moment. I do have several different activities here in front of us that I listed, and I've written some down as well. But I want to make sure you all know just uh, at least one that you leave with. Um, And again, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. So where do I want to start with this? Let me start with the doubling and the role reversal because I think those are maybe some of the most basic that you could incorporate into your therapy today, leaving this, and they've been incredibly powerful for me. Um, but when we think about a double, um, this is probably going to go against what you've learned in your training, in your schoolwork. Um, but I touch the clients, and that's part of psychodrama. These are the two main techniques used in psychodrama. And um, and so what I will do is if the client has been talking for 5 minutes and I think that I see something really important, or I feel like they've said something without saying it, and they've been talking for a while. Keep in mind with experiential work, I don't necessarily want them to talk all the time. I just want them to do with their bodies. I want them to be present. I want them to feel. So maybe they're talking about um, their parents, and um, their parents were arguing all the time, and their parents would leave them at home with a babysitter, or um, they had a sibling, and the sibling was the favorite, and so this client was just in his room as a kid all the time, and so the client's just talking about this for a long time. And what I would say is, do you mind if I double? And if I have a client, they already know what that means. The first time takes a little bit of education, but I would say, do you mind if I double right now? And they would say, sure. So what I would explain the first time is when I do a double, I'm going to say something that I think might be true, and I want you to repeat it if it does feel true. If it's not true, I just want you to correct it. So a lot of times the clients will try to say yes or no, but it's repeat it or correct it. And the other part of this that involves permission is, do you mind if I put my hand on your shoulder? And so, of course, some clients are not going to be comfortable with that, and absolutely that's fine. I would never, ever, ever touch a client without full permission to do so. But my office is set up in a way that that I can stand just behind the client and I just put my hand on their shoulder. So with that client, I may say, I've been alone my whole life. And and so then the client will sit and think about that. So they've been talking about being in their room and having this sibling and the parents leaving the home. And and so now they have a comforting hand on their shoulder and there's something about that weight. And then I've said something that they're like, that's it. And so they'll say, I've been alone my whole life. Or they may say, I've been alone most of my life, but now I have a spouse who sees me. So it doesn't matter if I miss a double. It's not about getting the double right. It's about them repeating or correcting what I've said. I'm seeing a lot of chat there. I don't know what the chat is saying. Let's see. And oh no, my chat went away. Can somebody read me a question if I need to hear it? I apologize if I missed it. Um, I'm trying to think what I'm missing with that. But there's something about the touch, and there's something about somebody saying something that is just deep. Oh yes, I remember what I was going to say. In this type of technique, a double has a way of dropping the topic deeper. So if I feel like as a therapist, we're talking about some good things, but it feels kind of surface level, um, this has a way of bringing the information down deeper. And now we have a theme to talk with the client about of I've felt alone my whole life, or I do have a partner who sees me. And then we can talk about, oh, wow, that must feel really good to have someone who sees you now. So a double it drops it down a few levels instead of staying on the surface. Another technique that's used in psychodrama is a role reversal. And what that looks like is there can be so many different versions of ways to use this too. But one that I use is an inner loving parent. This is one I use a lot. And so I'll have them identify somewhere in the room that a younger version of them is. And I can talk a little bit more in detail about how I use this. But essentially, I say, okay, this hurt was at 10 years old. Where is that 10-year-old in this room? And they may say, he's sitting in that chair over there. Okay, cool. Would you mind going to sit over there? And so then they're sitting in this role of a younger version of themselves. And I've had them physically move to be in another place in the office. So it helps their brain and their body to step out of adult client and now they've shifted and they feel like a younger version of them who experienced something really hard. And then what I will do with that is I will say, okay, who is someone that younger version of you needed to hear from? And that could be anybody. It could be a grandfather. It could be a youth minister, mom, dad. But I will also explain to them that when I do that work with myself, when I need the younger version of me needs to hear from someone who can provide some healing, um, that it's actually a present day version of me going back and having a conversation with a younger version of me. And so it doesn't have to be someone else. It can be yourself. And we call this the inner loving parent. So if you get into parts work, internal family systems, it fits right in line with that. I love internal family systems. What's hard about internal family systems, it feels like it takes a while to really have them connect with a part. Whereas what I'm talking about now, I'll just say, can you go sit over there where that part is? And so now, instead of doing a lot of mindfulness and almost putting them in a meditative state, sort of, it's just, I want you to go be that part. So they physically move and they just kind of drop into it a little more quickly. But so they're sitting in the seat where inner child is. And then I'll say, okay, so your grandfather, where is he in the room? And they may say, he's standing right over here. Okay, would you mind to stand in that place? And so they go stand there, and I'll say, what is grandfather saying to the younger version of you now? And so now, and at this point, usually the client is starting to cry, and they'll say something. So if we pretend we're working with the same client, he may say, I'm sorry you feel alone, but you're enough. And whatever it is, it doesn't matter what the client says. Again, this is where I may have something that I think that client needs to hear. And so I could say things to make them feel better, but the client knows what they need to hear. And the client knows who their grandfather is. And so if I try to represent who their grandfather is, that's that's not even fair. I'm coming up with my own thing and saying that's who their grandfather is, but they know their grandfather. So I'm going to let them speak for the grandfather to the younger version of them. And I'm going to listen very closely to their words. And sometimes that can be hard because sometimes they'll say a lot. But I'm really trying hard to listen to key phrases, key words. And if they say a lot, just making sure that I have maybe the last sentence that they said. After they finish saying all of those things, I'll say, okay, would you mind going to sit back in the other seat? So they've been standing where grandfather is, and now I'm asking them to go sit back where their inner child is. And so what I will do is I will step where they have been, where they were representing grandfather, and I'll say the words, I'm going to enroll as your grandfather. And then I'll speak the words directly to them, the exact same words that the grandfather said. And there's some nuances to this because I don't want myself to get blended in to be grandfather. So what I do is after saying those words, I'll step to the side, no longer holding the grandfather's place, and I'll tell the client, I want you to breathe that in. So I'll literally have them take a deep breath. And while they're breathing that in, a lot of times I'll step back into grandfather's role and I'll say the words again. And that can be incredibly healing for them. After doing that, I'll again step to the side and I'll say, I'm no longer enrolled as your grandfather. I'm just Nathan again. And I'll have them move back to their original seat. I do think it's important if we have them do parts work like this, especially with inner child. I don't want them to leave the room holding the role of a child. I want them to step back into an adult version of them. Um, I'm going to try to look at the chat. I see a lot going on here. Okay, let's see. Question: which of these exercises are most appropriate for group counseling, which are not or are harder to execute in a group setting? That is a great question. Um, and what I'm telling you with this exercise that I'm doing is an amazing activity for group work. I'm telling you how to do it where it is individual work, but what is amazing about this with group work is there's a little bit more involved as far as the setup of all of this, but for the sake of time, and also the first psychodrama training I went to, I think was 40, no, it's 28 hours. So I do not even want to attempt to cram that into an hour-long training. So I definitely appreciate the question. And also, I'm going to try to answer it as best I can, but also saying that before trying to go into group work incorporating psychodrama, I would recommend looking into a psychodrama training because there's just a lot to it and there's a lot that can go on. And there are really important parts of this. One of them being that I think it would be important to know here is when we do role reversals and the other part or person speaks, we would never give a voice to a perpetrator. We would never give a voice to someone who's caused harm to a client. That person may be in the room, um, but they don't get to speak. They've already caused enough harm. So there are nuanced things like that in psychodrama. So before I say go crazy with all these techniques, it can get pretty intense. And I've done the EMDR training and the certification, and before that thought that was the gold standard. And then I went to a psychodrama training, and it was just amazing, the processing that can happen. And as the client, you get lost in it too. You get so engrossed in what's going on. The therapist is there, but they kind of stand behind you. And I've been doing a scene before where I was like, where is that person? Like I have no idea where they are in the room. So it's very involved and incredibly healing. But also I would not recommend setting up a whole psychodrama scene in a group setting yet. I think trying a double with a client, I think is pretty safe. Like when you think you've seen, oh, I know what's going on here. Do you mind if I double? Do you mind if I put my hand on your shoulder and then I'm going to say something that I think is true, repeat it or correct it? I think that's a pretty easy, quick thing to try and to play around with. But to put on a full psychodrama um, after this training, I don't think I would recommend that. But your question, which of these exercises is most appropriate for group counseling? These are amazing for group work because what we can do is instead of me, the therapist, stepping in and out of roles, which is what I have to do with individual work, the client, and in psychodrama they call him the protagonist, can say, Bill, would you mind playing the role of my grandfather? And so the Bill steps in and says, I'm enrolling as your grandfather. And now we can have the clients do the switching, and I, the therapist, am just like kind of giving directions instead of me stepping in and out of roles, which might be a little bit more confusing. Um, but it I would say it's harder when you get more complex psychodrama scenes because you can have multiple people and that sort of thing. Um, but also it's amazing to do in group. So good. It's so good. Also, one you could do with group work. I've done this with individual, with couples, and with group work. This can be done all sorts of ways, and it's the river of connection. Now, I'm going to try to explain this quickly because I was going to try to end at about 15 till with my discussion and then open it up to questions. But this is one of the most powerful exercises I've done. So I gave you some techniques with the doubling and the role reversal. But this is a layout that you could use, and it's just so good. So I don't know if you're familiar with polyvagal theory, but um, it's this idea that we have a window of tolerance, and we have what's called hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Hyperarousal is this fight or flight energy, it's movement. So if in my story um, I fought to stay safe or connected, then that's what I do. Or if I had to run away and that's how I stayed safe, then that's what I tend to do. When we get pulled into our limbic system, our emotional brain, we revert to patterns. And so if I fought or fled, then I'm going to tend to do those as well when I get outside of my window of tolerance. So we need to work with our clients on recognizing we're getting to the end of our window. And when we get outside of our window of tolerance, we need to do some resourcing to come back in. And there are some experiential things we can do with that too. Um, Maybe I'm able to answer some of that in the last 15 minutes if it comes up, but sake of time, uh, resourcing to come back in the window. But there's the fight or flight energy. But if in my story I was not able to fight or flee because that was not as safe, then I get pulled into this freeze energy, this hypoarousal, this shutdown. And so when I'm explaining this, I've got all kinds of cards laid out in a room: anger, sad, anxious, chaotic, confused, happy, joyful, surprised, just as many emotion words as I can think of in the room in front of them. I might even outline the sides of that with some paracord or something like that to indicate there's an in the river and there's an outside the river. The beginning of them, I have a card that says trust and vulnerable. And I'll explain this in a minute too, but when they step into the river, it begins with trust and vulnerability. Um, but what I'll explain is one side of the bank is hyperarousal, fight or flight. The other side of the bank is hypoarousal, freeze, shut down. And I'll ask people to step one side of the bank that most resonates with them. And so it doesn't matter if they get that right. Sometimes they're like, I don't know. Let's just step onto one of the banks. It's not the end of the world if you get the wrong one right now. So then when they get there, and again, I'm going to explain this through group. You can do it with individual. Actually, let me explain it as a couple. So let's pretend like the couple goes to opposite sides of the bank. And then when they're there, I will say, will you show me with your body how that shows up? Again, I, as the therapist, can have in my mind, this is how they're supposed to look. But if I do that, that's not what their processing is. So I need to let them show me what it means to be running away or what it means to be fighting. Um, and then also what it means to shut down or freeze. What does that look like? And so I have them show that. And then I'll go to each side of the bank and I'll ask the other side, what's the story you're making up about that other person? And so maybe one person sees the other side and they say, he wants nothing to do with me. And and I do this for both sides, by the way. And the point of it is they're demonstrating how their bodies feel when they are dysregulated, when they feel threatened. And then they have to hear what someone else perceives that means, which may not be how they intend it, but it's the story that the other side's making up. So I may spend a little bit processing that. So what's coming up in your body as you're hearing that? So you can just play around with it, slow it down. Don't be in a hurry to get anywhere, but be in the moment. But then I will invite one of them. Would you mind stepping into the river? And again, they start at trust and vulnerability. And then, would you mind walking out what's coming up for you with that fight that you guys had? And they step into, I was afraid. I was afraid that you were going to leave me. And when I was afraid, I felt alone. And so they step into alone. And I've felt alone my whole life. And I don't want to be alone anymore. And then they just keep stepping to these things. And then we'll invite the other person to step into the river and walk it out with them. And a lot of times as they're talking, they'll keep stepping to different points. And you're facilitating this movement, this connection, and it's a really powerful activity. Some other things that I would say about that is one, sometimes people may be standing in the river, but they do something that is actually from hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And so we're not allowed to do that from in the river. Call it throwing hand grenades. And so um, if you're going to throw a hand grenade, I'll just ask that you step back onto the side because we're going to connect when we're in the river. And then also what I will tell them is when you're in the river and people aren't used to you being in the river, um, they're going to test to see if you're going to stay in the river. And so again, they're going to lob these things at you, and you have a choice of I'm going to step back in to fight, or I'm going to catch it and set it down beside me and continue to stay in the river and maybe step into hurt. That hurts to hear those words. Um, but I'm hopeful, stepping into hopeful that we can connect again. And so it's just a really powerful activity. I use that one all the time. It's great for couples work, and we can use it for individual work as well. So there are more, but I'm looking at the time, and they told me about 15 till to open it up for questions, and so I'm going to pause. I feel like I'm throwing a lot at you here at the end, but I wanted to make sure that you knew some layouts for some of the activities that I do. There are a lot more. I've written some down, but I would definitely recommend if this sounds interesting to look into an experiential training or psychodrama training. Both of those um, are. It's changed me as a therapist and even as a person, I would say. So. Um, Thank you all for your time. I'll open it to questions at this point.
Yeah, great information. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please put it in the chat box. And then we could read those out to them. While you're thinking, I'm going to post the information for next month's webinar. It's going to be breaking free from emotional and mental patterns that keep you stuck. So join us on March 14th for that. Let's see, May said, is there a place where we can get an overview of different experiential exercises like the ones you
Yes.
mentioned here? Good.
Yes. That's a great question. So I will answer it to the best of my ability, keeping in mind that I live in Tennessee. And um, so let's see. My introduction to ropes coursework was at a place called Adventure Works in Nashville. Um, and it was a good base knowledge. It got me started. And then I just can't recommend enough on-site workshops in it's right outside Nashville. It's in Cumberland Furnace. Um, but they do both an experiential and psychodrama training, and they are really good. Um, there is a place in Salt Lake City called the Harton House, and they often put on trainings as well. And then Houston Valley Psychodrama Institute is another one that I'm familiar with. I haven't done trainings through them, but I've done the trainings at Onsite and the Harton House. Um, and they're not really cheap, but also for what you get, the value is really good. So at Onsite, it's the last I saw is about $1,900, but it also pays for all the training. It's 28 hours. It pays for your lodging and food. And so if you have to travel to get there, everything's covered and you can just be present there and not have to worry about anything. But that was where I got most of my formal training in experiential work.
Nathan, how about utilizing music and drum circles and things like that?
I'm not as familiar with things like drum circles. I could see where I would maybe play around with it. But I'm not as familiar with that. I would maybe if I were doing that, not knowing as much, I could see where I would have some sort of activity planned with that of let's see if we can hit at the same time or come up with a different rhythm that works together. And oh, I notice you're playing this louder. Um, that's probably what I would do, but I don't know as much about that. Now, I will say, using music, some of these exercises, for instance, there's this one with the four chairs. And I will throw this one out really quickly if you want to play around with it. I lay four chairs kind of looking in the same direction in a line, and I have them sit in each chair and write some things down. And the back chair is their inner child. So they spend some time sitting there. The next chair is traumas that they've been through, hurtful experiences, and they'd sit there and write some things down for a while. The next chair is messages that they've received. So it's after their traumas. What did they believe about themselves and the world? And they write those down sitting from that chair. And then the next chair is what we call the facade. I don't mean that as a negative thing. I'm going quickly here, but I don't mean it negative. It's the version of them that shows up in the world in front of them. Um, and so it gives them some insight into who they were as a child before they were hurt, understanding how their traumas affected them, and then understanding how they show up now. And so I have the four chairs, and while I do that, a lot of times I have some sort of um, music playing that's therapeutic, and it has a way of bringing them down. So I do use music in therapy when there's some time of reflecting or just being mindful. Sometimes it helps set a mood. So that's how I use that. But I'm not as familiar with using drum circles.
Well, and earlier you mentioned about wilderness therapy, and have you had much experience with equine and other pets using that in therapy? I know there's another program up in the Mid South that uses dogs. I guess they give them the clients a puppy.
Yeah. Yeah, is that Capstone or
Uh-huh.
in Arkansas, is it Capstone? Is that the name of it?
Capstone. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Um, I know of that. Yeah, thank you, Mary. I know of that. I haven't been part of a program that does that formally. When I was in the residential setting, they considered doing that, but ended up, you know, you're having responsibility for living beings. It never happened. I do have a therapy dog that's with me all the time. She is wonderful. Um, so I use her, but she's not necessarily part of the experience. I mean, she could be, if the client said, I noticed this about Nala, that's fine. We would roll with what the client's bringing in, but it's not something that I'm formally going, let's use Nala to play this role or something like that. So I have heard about programs using animals. My training has not been using animals, but there is a lot of incredible work that can be done with horses, for instance. And I know of that. It's in the world of experiential therapy, but it's not a road that I've gone down at this point in my career.
I've heard amazing stories about how uh, an animal, horse or a dog, could break down barriers and walls
Right.
with the therapist that they've never been opened up before. It's just
Yep.
because of that animal.
Yep. Yep. Nala, she's so good. She will go and lay on the client's feet all the time. It's crazy, but and I tell the clients like you don't have to let her do that, and almost all of them are like, no, I want her to. So it's really sweet.
Great. Do we have any other questions? How about play therapy for kids?
I've done a little bit of that. It hasn't gotten me going like doing the work with the adults or the teenagers and adults. And I think the reason for that is um, I like working in the metaphor and being able to think in the abstract. And so I know a little bit about play therapy. And I would say it's probably considered experiential. But I felt weird doing play therapy. I felt like, man, if these parents were in here seeing this, they'd think, what are we paying this guy for? I just felt like I was playing with kids. But my understanding is that kids play through or process through play. And so they're working through their things while they're playing. And um, so having them do that is as part of the process. That was tough for me. I wanted to kind of get into the weeds and that sort of thing. But I know a lot of people love the play therapy. So
It's amazing. I had a therapist friend that he specialized in adolescents and would just sit there and talk to them while they played ping pong.
right.
And, and it broke down a lot of barriers that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for that information. And we appreciate everybody joining us today. And if you're in, Texas, please consider joining us at the Hope Rising Conference next week in the Woodlands, Texas. We have a great lineup of speakers, including Philip Rutherford from the National Council for Wellbeing, coming in from Washington, D.C. to speak. And then next month in Dallas, we have the Hope Rising Breaking Strongholds Conference, which is hosted by the Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship and Dr. Guy Earl. And he's actually going to be our speaker for next month on the same topic and share a little bit about the breaking down strongholds. So please join us back and we'll send out information. Thank you to Jacqueline Martinez for creating the CEU certificate. Now, one of the notes on that, she's going to email everybody that joined us today. Actually, Jacqueline, tell us about your process. I see you on.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so I make sure that everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email, and it'll have pretty much the same information. It'll just give you the link. Be sure to fill out your survey, and you'll be able to download and print, if you want, your certificate right there where you're at. So, and if you have any problems, I'll give you my information so you can contact me. And I hope to see you next month for our next webinar. So thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Hey, while I got you on here, would you close us with a word of prayer? Can I put you on the spot?
Sure. Father God,
Thank you.
All right. Father God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for all that you've done here today. This is a divine appointment. We just want to thank you for everyone here and just give them all traveling graces on their way home from work and continue to see us through as we serve the communities that we serve, Lord, and continue to do your will. Thank you for all that you're doing in the lives of people that we touch, Lord, and continue on our way and help us stay warm and help those in need. And thank you for the servant hearts that you've given us and the communities that we serve, and just continue to bring us together in unity. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Yes.
Thank you. Amen. And Trent or Parker, any last words? And thank you so much for hosting today. Thank you, Nathan, for a great presentation. We really appreciate your time and efforts putting together that.
I think we're good to go. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We hope you come back next month.
Thank you, Parker.
All righty. See y'all next month.